And today on the show, I'm delighted to be joined by my good friend, Jesse Jacoby. Jesse is the founder and managing principal at Emergent LLC. Now, Jesse is an expert in driving change and both the art and the science of change management. I've worked directly with Jesse a number of years ago on a particularly difficult procurement transformation journey and saw firsthand the critical role that effective change management plays. We've been talking a lot at the Art of Procurement about operating model design, as many leading organizations are really thinking about how to do more with less and use digital transformation as a catalyst for that journey. So I thought I'd invite Jesse onto the show to discuss operating models, when's the time for change, how to integrate change management into the journey, and the role that AI can play now in that process. So with all that said, Jesse, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Phil. It's good to see you, and it's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm delighted we get the opportunity to finally do this. And we always when I'm talking to procurement guests at the beginning, I ask them a question about their procurement background. Your background is different than a lot of our guests because it comes from more of a change perspective. So can you share a little bit about your background?
Yeah, happy to. I started my career at a tech startup where I spent a few years in a marketing and product development role. Then I moved into consulting. So I joined Accenture, then worked for Manpower's organizational consulting business, Right Management. Then my last stint was at Ideson Company. That was kind of the rounding up the big firms, if you will. And then after 10 plus years with those big firms in 2010, I started my own company, Emergent, focused on business transformation and change. And so for the past 15 years, we've helped Fortune 500 and middle market companies sort of navigate their most complex, multi-dimensional change initiatives. And you would recognize many of the companies and brands with whom I've partnered over those years, many Fortune 500s and several Fortune 200 companies along the way.
Now, we got to know each other through change from a procurement perspective, but you weren't necessarily coming at it with a procurement lens, but from a change lens. You've experienced driving change across pretty much every function within an organization. Are they very similar to each other at the end of the day, or are there differences in how you approach change with a procurement hat on versus an IT hat on versus a HR hat on, for example?
Yeah, we often get invited in for a transformation program, meaning something's dramatically changing or is being planned to change, and so sometimes that can germinate in a specific function, like procurement, IT, finance, HR. Those are sort of the likely candidates for where these things start, but inevitably, because of the nature of an operating model, the functions are connected cross-functionally.
Yeah.
So while we might get invited in sort of, at the behest of a chief procurement officer, those needs and transformation, efforts sort of spread laterally into the other functions at some point. And sometimes they start that way, just with the enterprise cross-functional alignment right out of the gate. And so you've got the C-suite aligned and it is cross-functional to start, but it does oftentimes sort of begin in a particular function, if you will.
I often like to level set on terminology, especially with terminology we use all the time. Like we use operating model as a term every single day. What does an operating model mean to you? So that we have the context, of the discussion that's going to follow.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of different definitions and academic and business buzzwords. So I didn't love any of those. So I sort of came up with my own metaphor, if you will. And I like organisms. And so I liken it to the human body. And so these are the kind of key components that allow the organism to operate successfully. So if we think about business processes, for example, those are the nervous system, the brain and the nerves of the organization. We've got the systems, the technology and IT, for example. Those are kind of the circulatory, respiratory systems that move information around. The organization is much like the skeletal or, muscle systems, right? Where things kind of are held together and move together in certain ways. We've got, the people and culture, which is kind of the heart and soul.
Yeah.
Not surprising. And then, we think about governance and decision rights and, again, getting a little nerdy, but like the endocrine system, which, kind of moves hormones around the body and enables these other systems to operate. And then kind of lastly, we think about, performance management. That's sort of the sensory system, right? The way like we perceive information and process it and take it back in. So I think about kind of those 6 components working together as a super system when we talk about the operating model.
I mean, it's really fascinating to think about it in that way, and that all those have to be present. Do you find that that's often how organizations approach operating model design, or that they're focused on kind of one thing, which might be, I would imagine the most common place somebody would come to start is, my process is broken, and so I need to fix my process, and then maybe I need to figure out how they get the right people in the right places to enable the to-be process, and then they do that, and then that's kind of, okay, I'm done, I've fixed my operating model.
Yeah, there's an appreciation that, especially now, like the organization, the company, complex companies in particular, there's so many interrelated, interconnected systems, processes, ways of working. And so there usually is an appreciation of that integration, but there is normally a particular facet of the operating model that they want to fix. And to your point, it's often kind of processes or, digitization, right? Kind of, elevating the tech stack to operate in a more, faster, more efficient, sophisticated manner. And so there is sort of, a fixation, maybe 1 or 2, kind of 3 of these facets of the operating model. But inevitably, again, once you sort of deconstruct and get to root causes, you start to find that, oh, we're talking about decision rights. We're talking about alignment. We're talking about, adjusting the culture, right? And so all of these things, for most companies, come into play at some point.
Yeah. I think of operating models as being something that, if you're not careful, it ends up constraining collaboration between organizations and creating even more silos versus actually enabling, more collaboration and fostering kind of partnership about business. How do you kind of think about, as you're looking at operating model design, the things that help make sure that you're not just putting in place more guardrails around which people can operate and kind of constraining them because of the design rather than the opposite?
Yeah, parts of the operating model indeed can be or become constraints to business performance. Over time, especially in some of the larger organizations, things accrete, and that's just a fancy word of saying, they grow or accumulate complexity gradually, sometimes imperceivably, over the years, right? They just kind of add new layers of things, and people come and go, and more things get added, and so just complexity accumulates. And so the processes, policies, procedures, technological integrations, it's like a ball of yarn when you deconstruct it, right? Things like that. So those do become constraints that oftentimes, need to be untangled or fixed or just sort of reconstructed. And sometimes that's the impetus for a business transformation. Is just we've grown and things have organically evolved a certain way, but now we need some intention behind our operating model design, and we need to fix some of these things that have accreted so that we can grow very intentionally into the future without adding even more complexity.
Do you find that there's typical red flags or roadblocks or things that help you see, what I think might be the time to take a step back and look at how we're organized from an operating model perspective?
Yeah, a lot of times that, sometimes they don't use the word operating model, right?
Yeah.
We need to, sort of, it might get talked about different ways depending on sort of the chapter of the company, or sort of what, what state they're in. If a company is in distress or obviously struggling, and the employees and investors know it, and it's best to talk about optimizing the operating model in a very forthright and transparent way. Other times it might be couched as needing to become more competitive in the marketplace, the need to grow our capabilities, or even become more, innovative and agile. So sort of the way it's picked up by the executives, the company leadership really depends on sort of how urgent and how obvious the need is.
Do you find that does the urgency change anything in the way that that this is approached?
It does, yeah. Sometimes if it's urgent and they waited too long to sort of fix the operating model, then the actions are more dramatic, more draconian, sometimes a bit ham-handed. Not because that's what we advise as the consultants, but because there's a burning need to kind of fix it and fix it fast. That's never a great situation for the company, and it's not an ideal circumstance for us to engage. Although we can and do our best in those situations, but it's often best done from foresight and a position of strength
Mhm.
and with enough runway to do the operating model work, which because it's interconnected, all those six components, and it's complex because the organizations are large and they've accreted information and systems over time. It takes time, so that's ideal.
I was going to ask this later, but I think you mentioning time is a good segue into that. How long? Yeah, you can think about an operating model change as being very specific to one organization, and you're doing it we're just changing the procurement operating model versus kind of an enterprise operating model perspective. I think one ultimately bleeds into another anyway, because you're all trying to react and respond to how other parts of the organization work. But when somebody comes and says, what, I'm thinking about how do we change the way we operate? Yeah, and again, they may not use, as you said, the operating model terminology. Does that trigger something in your mind to say, well, this is going to be a 12-month process or a 24-month process or a 6-month process? I know there's complexities, but nuances that would change that. But how long does operating model change take, from the beginning to actually we're now at our to be state?
Yeah, there are several sort of variables that are in that calculus. There's there's not formulae per se, but we can kind of look at the how big the organization is in terms of number of employees. What about the geographic footprint? Is it U.S. based only? Is it international on all of the continents? How urgent is the need to change? Right? How old is the organization? Meaning, sort of how many of these accretive layers have accumulated? The leadership, did it recently change? Is it old guard? Right. So there are certain sort of telltale signs, of course, just the economics of how the company is performing financially in the marketplace. A lot of the Fortune 500 companies are public, obviously. And so you can see that. It's hard to hide from that.
Yeah.
And so all of these variables sort of give you a telltale sign of how complex this might be. And of course, what are they trying to do? What is the vision for what they're trying to fix, right? There are a number of drivers for wanting to change the operating model. And so that in concert with all of those other variables I just mentioned, give you an idea. But often, it's these aren't 6 month.
It's not a quick fix.
No, it is not a quick fix. These are often phased, right? So but together the phases, it's usually a multi-year type of initiative, but phases and wins along the way. So you're making gains. It's not wait until the end and hope for the best. But phase one's going to harvest some optimization, some efficiency, some effectiveness metrics, and so.
Do you? Because I've done a number of these transformations, which involve operating model change, where the first kind of skepticism or objections you always get is, well, we did this 3 years ago, or we did this 5 years ago, and what's going to be different this time? And there's kind of this change fatigue. I'm interested, like, how do you position change as, an evolution of a journey versus a point in time transformation, that has a beginning, a middle, and an end?
Yeah, for the engagement itself, which is the operating model optimization or transformation, let's call it. Obviously that is an episodic event, albeit long, but it does have, kind of beginning, middle, end with, gates and milestones and accomplishments along the way. When we think about the change management support around that, we do position as a journey. It doesn't, it's not a point in time where things, change. And that's not how people work, right? People transition through phases of change, and there are waves of change. So it's not just one change. It's constant. I like waves in the ocean, right? They're just constant. They're not going to stop. And so it's a journey, and people move through it. But there's also, different waves of change. And so people need to build the muscle that is the new normal, which is, change is constant. And so rather than thinking about moving through just this one journey around operating model transformation, which we do, we'll help them through that. But we would also like to condition the clients and the culture and their people to think and behave in a way that allows them to basically be agile and just adapt and become their new normal to the constant waves of change. And so we might use, the operating model program as sort of a palette, if you will, to help the culture build some of that change readiness muscle within their culture, within their people.
Yeah, there's not necessarily such a thing as steady state anymore. It's just something else will be changing as you go kind of from one thing to the next thing. Now, as you're starting that change journey and you start, kind of planning for change around operating model redesigns, how do you baseline? Like, any tips on baselining where you are today versus kind of figuring out, okay, now this is what my to-be is?
Yeah, from a change management perspective, so we as change practitioners, we plug into typically larger operating model transformation programs. So we're kind of at the table with other kind of program leaders who are and the client, of course, who are running this operating model transformation or optimization program. But we're tending to the change management piece. And to your point, how do we sort of baseline or understand where they are at the beginning of this? We like to assess the organization's change readiness using, interviews with the executives, obviously information reviews. And then we do have sort of a survey-based change diagnostic that we like to use as well. And so kind of through those three methods, we get a pretty good understanding of where the organization is today and kind of set it up so that we can pulse it on some recurring increments, usually, a few months apart.
And the to be kind of the visioning, does that is that typically a journey as well, or do you find oftentimes that the leaders that you're working with already have the vision, they just don't necessarily know how to get there, and so that's really where the change comes from?
Yeah, they often do have a vision. These are smart executives running, global $100 billion, operations, and so of course they got a vision. And, we want to honor that and work with it. Sometimes, the vision doesn't necessarily count for all of the different facets of the operating model. So, largely it's usually on the numbers. And so, kind of rounding out the vision with some of the, the cultural elements or ways of working, some of the softer pieces. As we know, the soft stuff's often the hard stuff.
Yeah.
That's important to sort of, have in the mix in terms of the vision and make sure that that's getting addressed along with, the processes, the tech, the financial performance, et cetera, et cetera.
Now, a lot of the people who will be listening today will be thinking about operating model change just in the very specific context of the procurement operating model, and perhaps thinking about it not in a silo because that's negative, but they're just thinking about their own organization and how can their organization drive more value tomorrow than it did today through changing operating models. Do you find that it's possible to kind of make operating model changes in that more contained way, so without necessarily affecting other functions, business processes, or is it very hard to take that approach? And so you kind of need to take a bigger picture. I'd love to know kind of your perspective when you're starting on, I need to fix my organization, but how much of it is in my own, like, I'll just go and do it, versus how much do I need to bring in others to be part of the journey?
Yeah, it's way easier for a function leader, pick on procurement because of the art of procurement. And not to, besmirch procurement leaders in particular, but it's often easier to fix your function. I'm going to use the S word, a silo. Um, Not that, these leaders don't appreciate the interconnectedness, but when it comes to sort of fixing and optimizing, it's just easier, right? To work inside your house versus like, I got to go like get the neighbors involved and get their alignment. Then all of a sudden it becomes very daunting. But, picking on procurement again, it could be a starting point for a broader company-wide change initiative. Procurement, might be looking at the cost reduction and margin protection, especially amid inflation, or spend visibility and control over the spend, supply chain, resilience and risk. But again, these operating model transformations, by their very nature, are cross-functional and often or should be enterprise-wide. So, the end-to-end business process as well, originating in procurement, the processes, the systems, the governance decisions, the culture, et cetera, is all connected laterally with the other functions. And so each function has their own unique subset of these things. But holistically altogether, we're talking about the operating model. And so it can start in a function, finance, marketing, procurement, but inevitably it will or should expand into those adjacent functions because of all of that connective tissue. Another bottom metaphor.
I feel that's where some of the complexity comes in. And oftentimes when procurement is transforming and it's led from outside of procurement, it'll be led from usually a finance transformation that then brings procurement into it. If we're starting it from the ground up within procurement, how, I'm thinking the right way of asking this. You don't want to invite too much complexity, but you don't want to build something which is not fit for purpose. And so I'm just wondering kind of any guide on how much you involve kind of external stakeholders to your process when the focus purely is on procurement, but knowing that, you're operating as part of a bigger system.
Yeah, I would say therein lies the art and not the science of getting this right. Sort of how inclusive, how involved should the other stakeholders be and sort of optimizing for your function. If it's procurement, how much is finance involved, how much is operations involved, and in optimizing, the procurement specific processes, systems, culture, et cetera. I'm sorry, I'm going to give a lawyer answer. It just depends from the appetite, the culture, how, busy and interested those other function leaders are in what you're doing as a procurement leader, and the procurement leader themselves, how sort of open and willing are they to take that input, that feedback? Because if you're going to take the time to listen and get the feedback and get the input, you need to do something with it. And so this sort of obligates a leader who's doing the listening tour to actually really, implement a good portion of what has been taken in.
Yeah, and often these changes are with the intention of building a stronger perspective. A stronger perception of procurement. So they're coming from, I suppose it's a position of weakness. It's an identification that we want procurement to drive or to be a larger part of the organization, drive more value within the organization, and that's not happening today. And therefore, we need to look at how we operate, to drive that. And so they're actually, part of the journey itself is in influencing other stakeholders outside of procurement that this is important enough for them to show an interest in and to be a part of. Rather than, just pushing it on your own, and kind of to the same end.
Yeah. And that's, as consultants, that's some of the value that we bring is how to sort of, lock hand, lock arms with your colleagues to the left and right and the adjacent functions. And, how do you go about getting that input and, implementing, part of it in a way that doesn't, slow you down too much. But we like to sometimes say that, we it's okay to go slow, to go fast later.
Yeah.
Taking the time to kind of get the input, get the feedback and listen to the needs of where the connective tissue is, right?
Yeah.
Those key functions, not every function, just the key functions. Just taking the time, it might add a few weeks up front to kind of get that input, get that information and factor it into the solution design. But ultimately, you're going to have a better, stronger solution, and you're going to have the support and alignment of those folks.
Are there any common mistakes that you see? Yeah, you come into a situation and every single time, there are the same 2, 3, 4 mistakes that have been made, or just things that are missed or overlooked.
Oh, wow.
Put yours up there.
Yeah, exactly. Wanting to jump right in to solutioning and implementing without first sort of stepping back. The eagerness is great, but step back and make sure that the company has articulated a strong rationale for why the change is needed and needed now versus later. And what are the consequences of not changing?
Mm-hmm.
Sounds really basic,
Yeah.
but you'd be surprised at how not so great that's done often. The leaders don't take the time to kind of set the stage, if you will. Well, and then I would also say another sort of misstep is having a really strong business case, financial, economic, rational business case, but it's missing the appeal to the heart. So beyond just kind of the data-driven economics, performance-based business case, what is the emotional appeal? What is the aspiration, right? What is, kind of the vision, like you said, the North Star, like what's really gonna motivate people beyond just great, we're helping the company perform at a higher level.
Yeah.
Cool. But like motivate me as a human, and explain to me what's in it for me.
Yeah.
That's again, often overlooked. And so all of these sort of pitfalls that I'm citing are things that we tend to, as consultants focused on the change management journey and supporting the transformation, we make sure that, these things aren't forgotten and that they're tended to.
Yeah. The communications and telling a story around the why. It's, when I look at, especially on the digital side, digital implementations, and you see so many digital implementations not returning the kind of business case that was intended. And 99 times out of 100, maybe it's 90 times out of 100, but it feels like the lack of adoption is because there was no kind of deliberate and intentional focus on driving change and driving cultural change and the case for why I should try and do things differently rather than complaining that it's different and I don't want to change. That's often how things fail. It's not because the technology that was selected is not fit for purpose, but then everybody blames the technology when it doesn't work and when you don't get adoption rather than the change management that didn't necessarily go into that journey.
Yeah, 100%. People are incredibly savvy at finding workarounds, backs, and so having change stick is a whole nother element of the change strategy is just, making sure that beyond this chapter that we're in, which is the transformation stage where, we've got lots of consultants and concerted efforts and a program and a timeline, all that will end and go away. Mm-hmm. So how do you make sure that all of that goodness that you changed in your operating model and all the things you implemented, that the changes stick long term, right? Yeah, that's often a miss as well, as that sustainability phase, and then making sure you've got plans for it,
like to get the muscle memory, essentially, of the new way of doing business. Before we wrap, I just want to talk a little bit about AI. One, because I feel like I can't have a conversation these days without talking about AI, but also because AI brings lots of different interesting ways for us to be more effective in achieving the tasks and the goals that we're wanting to achieve. And so how can you use AI in terms of helping you as you think about the operating model design process?
Yeah, we found that it can turbocharge the analysis from now in the company baseline data, and also sort of in looking across, the operating model elements, uncovering new opportunities to enhance it. Things that the human eye, necessarily couldn't spot manually. And it can also take a, function. It can look at a specific function and do an analysis on that function, and really, kind of look for optimization opportunities. But it's even better at looking holistically across, sort of enterprise and all the functions to identify enterprise-wide opportunities that may have otherwise been, overlooked because of the myopic focus on a particular function. So it's really good at sort of augmenting the human analysis in terms of the operating model work.
Yeah, because I can imagine kind of connecting dots that you wouldn't ordinarily see, for example, across function. Um, do you see that AI itself is driving an increased focus on operating model design? Because now organizations are looking to say, okay, we now have, before it was people process, digitization, let's say for technology. Now we have AI and an agentic AI to build into this. Okay, how do we have all these connect together? Are you seeing that be a conversation now among the organizations that you're working with?
Oh, for sure. And obviously it's all over the news. Tech and creative roles in particular are taking, kind of a big hit right now. But there is no function within the organization that cannot, and at some point in time will not be optimized with AI. Don't confuse what I'm saying with headcount reduction and replacing.
Yeah.
That's not my view, and it's not Emergent's, perspective. We believe that AI is primarily an enabling tool that employees can use to make dramatic productivity and improvements, and eliminate some of the mundane work, so they can get higher value work by handing off the kind of the lower end stuff to the AI. And this points to kind of one other, huge change and transformation opportunity, which is optimizing the workforce to work side by side with AI, in skilling the workforce on how to, kind of leverage that AI to its full potential in their roles. So not replacing them, but working side by side with AI, and taking all of the advantages that AI has to offer for those people in those roles. And so kind of because of that, I'll say, lastly here on the AI piece, that companies will need really clear AI rules of the road, and, approved kind of AI tools and policies and secure environments in which to use the AI. And of course, upskilling other people on how to use AI in all the different ways that can benefit them in their roles, not replace them.
Yeah. No, we look at it and think, AI is really good for the messy middle, of the work that we have to do, but you need the human at the beginning and the expert at the beginning and the expert at the end. Yes, in procurement at least, budgets getting to the point where there is more money now being invested in digital technology than there is in people. People is more flat. It's not that people is declining, it's just flat. And so then, as you are getting folks leaving roles, perhaps they're not being replaced by another human. There's now the team is tasked with figuring out how to be more efficient because of kind of natural folks leaving, rather than people just being told you've got no job because of AI. And we're having to kind of figure out kind of that balance. But I'm interested, kind of final question on this is, you talked about the need to help employees from a what I really see as being digital literacy to be able to work with AI tools. Do you always recommend that training is a big part of any change journey, of the team, to be able to make things stick, like you said before, and not just expect that everyone's going to be able to figure out how everything works in the new world?
Yeah, and sometimes it's couched different ways. It's training, it's upskilling, reskilling, learning programs, and in today's sort of fast-paced environment, where there's kind of continuous partial attention and limited attention span. The way that learning is absorbed by adults is typically in kind of small, bite-sized pieces and the channels that they prefer. So, we think of traditional training programs um, around operating model design or even AI, opportunities. It's not what you might traditionally think of in terms of training.
It's not a 3-day workshop where
It's
everyone's
not a workshop. It's probably not even an hour of anything. It's very like I said, bite-sized, kind of, internal social media, if you will, quick hits, but through different channels and different, peak parts that can accumulate over time and give, an employee kind of the knowledge they need to perform at the next level.
Yeah. Well, Jesse, I know it's about time to wrap up. It's been a pleasure to welcome you onto the show. I've seen firsthand, the impact that the work that you does on driving change within procurement organizations like we worked together on. If anyone is interested in reaching out, connecting, learning a little bit more, where would be the best place for them to go?
I'll keep it simple, Phil. Find me on LinkedIn.
All right.
Or our website, emergentconsultants.com.
All right. Well, what we'll do is we'll include a link to your LinkedIn profile and your website on our show notes for today's episode. Those are going to be at artofprocurement.com/podcast. That's with all of the other episodes that we have. So that's artofprocurement.com/podcast. Jesse, one last time, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Phil. It's an honor to be on Art of Procurement. And with you once again, thank you so much for your time.